Hey, everybody, welcome to the briefing room. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Great to have you with us on this Tuesday. Impeachment is still the talk of the town, and today, as House Democrats try to expedite their impeachment inquiry of President Trump, the White House and Republicans are saying not so fast. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who himself was subpoenaed for documents as part of this probe today, pushed back on the committee chairman request to interview officials from the State Department, depose them as soon as tomorrow, writing in a public letter, take a look, that he will not tolerate such tactics, referring to the rush here in this letter. He said, "I will use all means at my disposal to prevent and expose any attempts to intimidate the dedicated professionals whom I'm proud to leave and serve alongside at the Department of State." Pompeo essentially daring these Democratic committees to subpoena these officials, although not ruling outright that they will refuse to comply. Meanwhile, as we said, Pompeo himself faces a subpoena to comply with. Also, the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, yesterday here on the show, we told you he was subpoenaed as well to turn over documents. And it doesn't sound like Giuliani or Pompeo are in any hurry to abide by those requests. Here's Rudy Giuliani last night. Take a listen.
I'm weighing the alternatives. I'll kind of like go through it. I'll get all my evidence together. I'll get my charts. I don't know if they let me use videotapes and tape recordings that I have. If they let me get some of the evidence that I gathered. And I have to tell you, Sean, all this nonsense about I was interfering in the election, I gathered all this evidence before the Mueller probe ended. So it was clearly under my responsibility as the lawyer for the President of the United States. Well,
all right, Giuliani going to take his time. ABC News has also just learned that he's hired an attorney to represent him in all of this. Here is who's going to represent Rudy Giuliani, Attorney John Sale. Take a look. Former assistant U.S. attorney in New York, also a former assistant prosecutor in the Watergate probe. There he is, John Sale, now representing Giuliani. So will the White House stonewall House Democrats in their requests? How will Democrats respond to all this? And, of course, will any of this information ultimately matter as Democrats draft those impeachment articles that are expected? For more on this, I want to bring in our senior congressional reporter today, Kira Phillips, who's up on Capitol Hill. Also want to bring in John Bies. He's chief counsel with American Oversight, a watchdog group here in town, also a former Justice Department official. John, thank you so much for coming in. Kira, great to see you. John, I want to start with you. We've gotten sort of mixed signals from Rudy Giuliani. We saw there, he says on the one hand, he's the president's personal attorney. On the other hand, he was dispatched by the State Department. Maybe executive privilege is at play. Can he have it both ways when facing these requests?
I don't think he can have it both ways because those are very different roles and his obligations are very different. He was out there representing the president's personal interests, his private interests, the interests of his campaign when he was making these trips. He wasn't out there representing the people of the United States, and that makes a big difference for how privileges and interactions with Congress might apply.
And help us understand that. He's sort of asserting, on the one hand, attorney-client privilege, on the other hand, executive privilege, or just trying to create a lot of smoke. How does this play out? Ultimately, will this end up in court?
It could end up in court. It's up to Congress how they want to proceed. If he doesn't agree to answer, he would be in contempt of Congress, and they can take what steps they want. They could draw an adverse inference and just proceed with the facts they have, making that, assuming that because they're obstructing the stonewalling the investigation, the information is bad, or they could try to get a quick court ruling that he's obligated to respond.
Well, you've brought a lot of these cases in court. Nothing is quick when it comes to these demands for documents, right? I mean, so this, we could be headed toward court, but also Democrats could likely just move on.
Right. They could decide that it's better to move quickly and get this done and not take the time to go to court. But
yeah, I mean, this is Kira Phillips. We were talking before the show here that Democrats actually seem to be preparing themselves for the likelihood John Bies is talking about, that this isn't going to go anywhere quickly, and so they seem inclined. They're sending some signals up there on Capitol Hill that they will simply write this into the articles of impeachment, a slow walk, a stonewall, a refusal to comply and participate.
Well, it's interesting when you look back and forth at the tweets and the statements among Secretary of State Pompeo and the three committees involved in this impeachment probe. All of them are accusing each other of intimidation. Now, when it comes to these subpoenas that have been issued, Pompeo, as you said early on, is saying, hold on just a second. My employees are not going to comply, that this is intimidation and bullying. He actually states that in a tweet that he put out this afternoon. However, for the committees, in that letter that you mentioned to Pompeo said, quote, the failure of any of these department employees to appear for their scheduled depositions shall constitute evidence of obstruction of the House's impeachment inquiry. So they're going right to obstruction in that letter. They're not looking for a court battle. And that's what we saw in the Mueller investigation, but we're not seeing that here. So if you read further on, it's important to point out the language here. And key Democrats also pointing to the third article of impeachment against Richard Nixon, where his failure to comply with a committee subpoena, we saw how that turned out.
So the showdown is playing out, both sides digging in on these document requests. Meanwhile, John Bies, there's a lot of interest and a major fight brewing over the whistleblower, this person who brought all this forward, who raised the complaint to begin with. The president had initially said that this person should not be believed because the information was secondhand. Then today, as you know, the Inspector General of the intelligence community came out and said, actually, the whistleblower has some firsthand information. And then we've seen Republicans start to rally to his defense. I want to share with our viewers a statement from Senator Chuck Grassley, influential Republican, longtime advocate for whistleblowers throughout the government. Here's what he said in a public letter, sort of responding to the president, I think. He says, uninformed speculation wielded by politicians or media commentators as a partisan weapon is counterproductive and doesn't serve the country. Complaints based on secondhand information should not be rejected out of hand, but they do require additional legwork to get at the facts and evaluate the claims' credibility. It does seem, John, that there is a growing consensus in this town. You've dealt with whistleblowers before all the time at American Oversight, that this person is legitimate.
He's legitimate, and he's entitled to have his identity protected. And, you know, you can't have it both ways. If your complaint is the information is secondhand, but you're stonewalling on giving over the firsthand information, it looks like obstruction to me.
And how useful do you think this information will be? Again, you hear from whistleblowers. You guys are a watchdog, so you get these sort of complaints. As the Democrats start to build their case, how important is it to hear from the whistleblower firsthand, behind closed doors?
I think if he has firsthand information, he can give them an account and put the pieces together for them. But I think they should also go out and try to dig and get all the firsthand information they can get.
And that's what they're trying to do. Kira, meanwhile, the White House seems unbothered by all of this. You've been talking to White House officials the last 24 hours and also following those Twitter accounts. There's been some pretty unusual tweets coming out from not just the president, but from some of his close aides and all this.
Well, and it was a little odd this morning. I mean, first of all, the president was getting criticized over the weekend for playing golf while this whole inquiry is taking place. And then this morning, we woke up to this post by Dan Scavino, the White House director of social media. Good morning. Another great day in the swamp. Another great day in the swamp begins. And then take a look at it. Let's listen.
They've got a lot of time on their hands over there, Kira. They apparently are signaling that they're not too bothered by any of this.
No, and obviously, I mean, we really thought it was a bit odd. We had to actually make sure this was Dan Scavino's account when we all saw this come across. But then also, as for President Trump, you and I were talking about this, Devin, he's definitely doubling down. I mean, first thing this morning, he puts out a tweet. Take a look at this. He posted this image. Try to impeach this, he says. Those words plastered across a deep red 2016 election map suggesting that Democrats are threatening to overturn the will of the voters. So pretty interesting weekend and morning with regard to social media.
It has a circus quality to it at the outset of this inquiry as well. Day 2 here only. Kira Phillips on Capitol Hill, thank you so much. John Bies with American Oversight, thanks for coming in, John.
Thank you for having me.
For the political ramifications of all this, as this continues to play out, the campaign is underway. Let's bring in our political director, Rick Klein, for his analysis in all this, because we have seen a surge in support for impeachment the past few days in a number of public polls, but there's still a cautiousness out there, Rick. I want to get your reaction to what we've been hearing for some of the voters. Our campaign team has been taking the temperature out there on the campaign trail. Here's some of what we've been hearing.
My feeling was that they wouldn't be taking this step if they really didn't feel like they can move forward with it. And it's also our responsibility to not let the President of the United States be beyond the limit of the law.
Some of my friends who are Trump supporters. Some of them are like, yeah, that's stepping over a line. I think they need to be, investigating him. And others are like, no, there's no wrongdoing here. It's just him being him, and that's just how he talks.
Oh, I think the Democrats are just shooting themselves in the foot. I think they're just gonna, if this doesn't go through, it's gonna cause more publicity for Trump, and he's just gonna prove, the Democrats wrong.
Up until very recently, I've been leaning more not toward impeachment. I feel like it's not necessarily the best use of our time and money as we go into the 2020 election. That being said, with the most recent events, I'm a little bit more on the fence at this point because, these allegations are so egregious, and our current occupant has already proven that he is not trustworthy.
Rick, so a surge for impeachment, a surge for potentially removal from office, in the poll numbers at least. But gosh, talking to people, hearing from real voters shows there's a good bit of skepticism there and apprehension about what's could go down here.
And if there's a through line among Democratic voters and even lawmakers is they can't screw this up. They recognize that the stakes are so big that once you pursue this, once you go there, no false steps are allowed. That once you take that fateful step of pursuing an impeachment inquiry, the vote may land wherever it lands, but if you make a mistake along the way, it can backfire big time. We know this president is poised to take advantage of that, and I think that's the kind of angst you hear reflected among voters.
You wrote about this a little bit today in the note, and I want to also bring in here some new polling that came out. We talk about the poll numbers for impeachment, but we'll also talk about some new fresh polling, including some of our own, on the actual conduct at question here. Two different questions, right? So people can have a different view of the conduct and maybe think it doesn't merit impeachment. But this is striking to me in a Monmouth University poll just out today. Almost half the country thinks that the president actually did, his statements notwithstanding, try to pressure the Ukrainians to investigate Joe Biden. Only 20% don't think he did that. A handful think it might not really matter, or they don't know. How damaging is that to the White House, though, that the negative view of the conduct here seems to be so high?
What's interesting is that you're hearing even Republicans say they're not surprised by the conduct. The question is, do you think it's serious or not enough or not to pursue impeachment? I think people have gotten used to this president to some degree, but that's why Democrats are seizing on this moment, because they say this is a moment you have to stand up to the president, otherwise we'll see more conduct like this. That's why the investigations, that's why the impeachment inquiry.
Even within the party, you alluded to this a little bit earlier on the Democratic side, as they remain divided. They're sort of, as the White House looks at these numbers, they're a little nervous. Democrats very nervous as well, but the risks, you've alluded to that. Hillary Clinton today, I want to get your reaction. She was on Good Morning America. She's been relatively quiet, low profile in this whole fight until now. She came out very forcefully and said all those concerns Democrats have about impeachment are unfounded. Here's her view.
The evidence concerning Ukraine is so dramatic and irrefutable because it came right out of the White House. So let the impeachment inquiry proceed. I know that they will do a thoughtful, thorough job. Nobody should jump to any conclusions.
What do you think about President Trump calling for the accuser, for the whistleblower, to be outed?
I think that's really dangerous. From everything we know, and we don't know much, this is an experienced person who saw things that bothered him. That's what the whole whistleblower statute is for, and it is to protect their identity. And I understand he's going to testify, and we'll let the process unfold.
I'm struck, Rick, by the boldness of her assertions there, perhaps not surprising. But then you have people like Andrew Yang, who was here in the briefing room last week, publicly wringing his hands over whether this is actually a good idea to go down this path. There's still a lot of angst among the 2020 candidates over this.
There is. They're all on board at this point, including Yang, in saying that there should be an impeachment inquiry, but they don't know where the process lands. And just an important piece of perspective, just as a public service announcement, you know, Devin, the baseball playoffs start tonight.
That's right.
There's going to be an entire other season and another playoffs and World Series after this one before next fall's election. So there is a lot of time. So even if this plays out on the timeline that Democrats are talking about by the end of the year, or even February or March, there's a lot of things that are going to happen after this drama plays out, regardless of how it turns out.
And that's why they're rushing to maybe get it under the bus by the end of the year. Rick Klein, always great to talk to you. Thanks for coming in, Rick.
Thanks, Devin.
Appreciate it. Impeachment has, for some Democrats, been a big moneymaker. We're starting to get the first sense of how much money some of those 2020 presidential candidates hauled in the third third quarter. Let's take a look at some of these numbers here for third quarter totals so far. The reporting deadline was yesterday. Some of the candidates have decided to publicly announce. Bernie Sanders, at least in this early 24 hours after the deadline, is on top of the charts here with $25 million over the last 3 months. That is a big haul for him. Pete Buttigieg down a little bit from the second quarter, but still an impressive $19 million. Cory Booker, you may remember earlier this week, announced he's going to stay in the race. He raised enough to meet his own mark there, $6 million in the third quarter. So what does all this mean? Let's bring in our two political mavericks here, Johnny Verhoeven, Will Steeken, who covers the Trump campaign. Guys, great to see you.
Thanks, Devin.
A lot to talk about here. Johnny, what do you make of these numbers?
Well, I think right off the bat, you have to acknowledge, and I think this is something that all of us sort of acknowledged from the beginning, is that Bernie Sanders is here to stay. I mean, that's an incredibly impressive number that he posted this morning. It's the highest total of any Democratic candidate thus far, and I think it proves that, he still really has that base of grassroots
and Pete
funding.
Buttigieg, too, somebody who has been hanging out in the single digits of the polls, hauls in these impressive sums of money. What is that from?
I mean, you can't understate how impressive it is. The fact that this guy didn't have an email list to begin with was really kind of an unknown in the Democratic Party. He's raised over $50 million this cycle to date, which, is far more than, sitting senators, former governors, people that have been in this race. So I think, even though he's still down in the polls, I think this proves that he still has the resources to compete pretty far into this thing.
And those three have met the new requirements, obviously, for the November debates, the bar getting a little bit higher to meet those. What are you expecting to see from Andrew Yang, someone who just eked it out, got in the last round of debates? He's talking a big game, at least dropping some hints that he's still going to be in this for a while.
That's right. Yesterday, he said that his campaign met their $2 million goal for kind of the end of the quarter. And I think it'll be really interesting. I mean, Andrew Yang is somebody whose candidacy was kind of born online and is now coming into age in real life. People are sort of starting to get to know him through these first couple debates. And I think his numbers this last quarter will be key in determining, just how much staying power is he going to have, once we start to get to people actually voting in, February. All
right, Will Steeken, meantime, the Trump team also talking a big game when it comes to campaign cash. This is the lifeblood of these campaigns. Mm-hmm. They said they raised $15 million in the past 5 days.
Yeah, actually, a few days after Nancy Pelosi made that announcement, they're crediting that to this announcement about impeachment. 50,000 new donors is what they're saying they got strictly after that Nancy Pelosi thing, and they did that through $1 million investment in online and strictly in Facebook ads. They did
$10 million
$10 million with RNC TV buy.
Put that into context for people. They hear all these numbers: 10 million and 1 million. I mean, these are very significant sums this far out to be spending on advertising.
More than some Democrats raised in an entire quarter.
Yeah, and I think it shows just how much they think they can capitalize on this moment. I just talked to the campaign right before I got on here, and they were saying they view this as a positive, this impeachment push, and they see it in the numbers, in the fundraising, in the donors. And so I think this is what you're going to see, a forward push for impeachment. They think they can capitalize on it. And so far, it seems to bear out. Their FEC numbers, they haven't reported or made any news that way, so we're all waiting for that to see how much the big number is. But
what the official total is. It's been big for them. All right, Will Steeken, thank you so much. Our Trump campaign reporter, Johnny Verhoeven, as always, our political guru of all the campaigns, but covers Joe Biden as well. Thank you so much, guys. Well, we don't know, speaking of Joe Biden, we don't know Joe Biden's fundraising numbers just yet for the quarter, but we do know he's getting much more scrutiny in this race right now, in part because of his role and his place in this impeachment inquiry involving President Trump and the Ukraine. Those questions about his conduct as vice president giving some Democrats a little bit of pause as they consider their frontrunner. For more on this now, I want to bring in Claire Malone, reporter with 538, who just did a deep dive into the state of Joe Biden's campaign. She's joining us from the road as she's reporting. Also, Mike Muse is here. Our good friend Mike Muse from SiriusXM joins us from New York. Hey, Mike, I want to start with you, Claire. Your story is fascinating, and here's the headline of the story. It's Joe Biden frontrunner ? What vulnerabilities have you uncovered there with Joe Biden right now, and with which voters?
Yeah. So it's interesting that Joe Biden's really core base of support comes from African-American voters. And one thing that we've watched over the summer is Joe Biden kind of have his record with race sort of raked over. And a lot of my piece was trying to figure out whether or not that support from the Black community will hold. And I think a lot of, question marks are, hence the headline, a lot of question marks are arising, especially as this Hunter Biden, Ukraine, Trump investigation scandal kind of unfolds. even though there's no factual basis for those allegations that Trump is making. Biden plus corruption in the news isn't great, and it maybe is giving some voters pause. So he's been a little bit more anemic in the polls lately, and we see Elizabeth Warren kind of nipping at his heels. So trying to figure out whether or not Joe Biden, who is run for president 3 times now, will actually hold out.
And Mike Muse, as Claire was alluding to, and it's written about in her piece, Biden has banked his candidacy on the durability of support among African-American voters, especially in South Carolina. I know you've spent some time down there. Is this pretty much sewn up for Joe Biden among African-American voters? I mean, is this done at this stage? If those primary voters haven't peeled off for Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, I mean, is this pretty much it?
No, nothing is guaranteed. 2020, everything is still up in the air. I don't think any demographic has really keyed in on who their candidate is going to be. But I will say, though, that Vice President Biden's position with the African-American community is really strong. I think you have to look at it in 2 particular segments of the African-American community. One of the segments is what I would call the older generation. And then the second one is the millennial Twitterverse of young African-Americans. So the younger African-Americans care a lot about digging into his past. They care a lot about what he represents. And the thing they really key in on is a crime bill. A lot of young African Americans really care about criminal justice reform, the prison pipeline, really reversing course on those scenarios. And when they dig into his record, they see trouble with that. But with the older generation, though, you see a split because they were there during that time. They recognized the context of what was happening during that crime bill, and they also recognized that it just wasn't Joe Biden who was supporting it, but it was also church communities. It was the black church leaders who were supporting this crime bill. It was the black community who was also supporting this crime bill. And so the black community that are older had that history. They had that context, and they had that understanding of where we are then versus where we are now. The thing I have to ask the Biden campaign is, are they doing a good enough job in really bringing in the context of the history and what was going on around that time period and who else in the black community was supporting it? And then what are they going to do now to address criminal justice reform? But I think the older community, that bridges his association with President Obama and the things that the Obama administration did to really do their best to curb criminal justice and criminal justice reform and really offering the police commission.
Yeah, and all that concern, all that history, Mike, that you talk about has been out there now. It's been litigated in 3 debates. Claire Malone, I mean, what is it going to take? You raised some questions, talk about some yellow flashing lights potentially for the Biden campaign with African-American voters. What did your reporting tell you about what might be enough to break that watershed of support?
One thing that's interesting to watch Biden do on the road is kind of overcompensate almost for the crime bill. So when he speaks on the road, he goes out of his way to talk about sentencing reform and his new criminal justice plan. And sometimes he talks about the crime bill almost so much that it obscures a lot of the issues, the contemporary issues that I think a lot of young voters, a lot of young black voters care about in general. So, the school to prison pipeline was mentioned, but also things just about the minimum wage and the environment, these kind of newer issues where Biden and Biden's team do have a big, sort of chip on their shoulder about the crime bill and about their reputation, that they end up talking about it quite a bit. And I do think you see it in the numbers that younger black voters don't have a good feeling about Joe Biden. Now, they're stronger than other young groups, in part, I think, probably because the Obama connection. But I think Biden in general struggles with younger voters, struggles to connect with them on some level. He's done a lot of just dwelling on his own history. And I think that starts to make you look a little bit out of step with a lot of the changing ideas about social justice that the party's discussing right now.
Really astute analysis. It's a great piece at 538.com. Frontrunner ? By Claire Malone. She's a tough booking. We're happy we got her today in the briefing room. Claire, thanks a lot. And our thanks to you as always, Mike Muse. Great conversation, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next today, could Washington, D.C. become the sex capital of the United States? That's a question that some people are asking after 3 D.C. council members have now proposed a bill to decriminalize sex work in the nation's capital. The bill is called the Community Safety and Health Amendment Act of 2019. If it passes, it would make the district the only place in the United States outside of a few counties in Nevada where prostitution and sex work are legal. As you can imagine, this has set off a pretty fierce debate. A public hearing will be held next week, and a number of groups are raising questions about this debate. One of the advocates in that fight is here with us now, Yasmin Vafa. She is the executive director of rightsforgirls.org. Yasmin, thanks for coming in.
Glad to be here.
It's great to see you. So legal prostitution, good idea?
So it's a fraught question, and I think one that is really complex. We're seeing legislation like this introduced not only in D.C., but in places like New York and elsewhere throughout the country under the guise of decriminalizing sex work, as you noted. But I think what a lot of people fail to recognize is that in doing so, we're actually legitimizing and legalizing the entire industry. So what this would do is actually repeal the laws against pimping and pandering, purchasing sex, and brothel keeping, which we're concerned would actually fuel exploitation of vulnerable communities.
Yeah, your organization, rightforgirls.org, very concerned about that. Advocates of this bill share your concerns, of course, but they say that this would allow for safer sex, it would allow for some transparency, allow women to come forward to regulate the trade. Of course, they say there would be protections against trafficking. But I was struck in some reporting. Our Tom Shine, senior producer here at ABC News, did some work on this. He found one victim of sex trafficking was reported to have said that her pimp informed her that this was happening and was very excited about it. I mean, that's the sort of testimony that's got to trouble you.
Absolutely. I mean, we do a lot of work with young survivors of the sex trade here locally as well as across the country through our partnership with Courtney's House, which is a survivor-led program here in the district. We've heard from young survivors between the ages of 9 to 24. Many of them came to us because their traffickers told them about the legislation. We organized a closed-door listening session with several members of the council and their staff to hear from these young people directly, and they indicated that, don't you think there's something wrong if our traffickers are excited about this and are in fact planning around the passage of this legislation.
So a big debate ahead next week in D.C. We hope to have you back, Yasmin Yaffa with rightsforgirls.org. An interesting conversation, to say the least. Thank you so much for coming in. Thanks for joining us here in the briefing room today on this Tuesday, a packed show. We got to wish the 39th President of the United States a very happy birthday today. Jimmy Carter turns 95 today. He is now officially the oldest living former president in American history. There he is. A salute to the son of planes, Nobel Peace Prize winner and U.S. Naval Academy graduate. He's off in the coming days to Nashville to build some homes for Habitat for Humanity. Happy birthday, Jimmy Carter. Thanks for being here. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. We'll be right back here, 3:30 Eastern Time tomorrow. Have a great afternoon.